Thanks, Brian, for the introduction. This is collaboration work with ourselves, with Socrates Kyprios, who's Professor Emeritus in Paul Scherr Institute in Switzerland, Antti Lehtila, who's our programmer in VTT in Finland, and with Brian. So we're a modelling group, and we have looked at these global models, building macroeconomic hybridization onto those models. But we want to apply those models to equalising or making the final results equitable. So, just starting off briefly from giving a perspective, I want to talk about people rather than numbers. Starting out, it's late in the day, and people's ability to absorb the kind of numbers is kind of reduced. This is a photo of my great-grandparents in west of Ireland, circa 1890. Little to no fossil energy involved in their life. They were farmers. Their energy would have been either manual energy from themselves or would have been horse-driven. Their carbon footprint was practically negligible. That was the average Irish tonnes per capita per year was less than a couple of kilos per person per year. My great uncle then in the 1850s, again farmer in the west of Ireland, the average per capita tonnes of CO2 started to rise in the 1950s, but it would have been hugely unequal given development that would have been going on the east coast in Dublin in the city compared to the rural, more farming communities in the west and the south. This week last year I had the pleasure of going to a wedding in India, but my carbon footprint per person is much higher. 12.5 tonnes is the Irish average per year. But the thing that raising these photos and raising this point is the wedding was great fun, but we went off and had a week travelling around where we had a driver which was ridiculously cheap, and he ended up bringing us to his family based in Jaipur and outside Jaipur. They were farmers, and it was really interesting to me that the familiarity with which my bachelor farmer neighbour growing up, how he lived, how Papu, our driver, his parents, and how their children lived. A lot of similarities, possibly to do with the British influence, but it was very, very curious to me, and it was very, very interesting. So this bridging gaps or bridging regions and bridging time, that there's those relationships that are there. The whole purpose of the presentation, really, again, it's about people and trying to put faces on those people. These are my nephews and my brother-in-law Sylvan. So what is their carbon footprint now, and what will it be going forward? Charlie there at the bottom is 3. He'll be my age in 2050 when all these targets start to really bite. And Papu's nephew, same age, 3. What opportunities will he have? Should they be? How can we ensure that they have the same opportunities going forward, the same growth opportunities? So quickly going on then to the modelling and to the numbers. A lot of the climate models that are integrated into our global energy systems models are statistical, and they're always talking about different atmospheric concentrations. But there's really a way of simplifying the whole equity problem and the whole budget problem. This is our global budget, 3,200 gigatons of CO2, post-industrialization, out to whenever you care to look forward. That will bring us beyond a 2-degree scenario. For me, I suppose just another way of looking at it is placing it as a clock, and you can see the pace of change. So the first 300 gigatons of CO2 took 175 years to emit, 34 years for the next, and an acceleration faster and faster as time goes on. So the question really is, are we going to continue going as we're going? 20 years, we bust through that 3,200 gigaton budget, or are we going to be able to spread it out, rapidly change the current trend of our global energy system, and spread it out, give ourselves time to go net negative emissions? So the scenarios and the types of energy systems models that are used in the IPCC, they're these broad integrated assessment models. Some of them are top-down CG type models, some of them are bottom-up technology-rich models. Ours is one of the bottom-up energy-rich models, or technology-rich models, so there's over 1,500 technologies in there, all that cost the capex, the operating costs, variable costs, assumptions regards GDP, assumptions regards all the different kind of investment costs. So it's a least cost optimization, and then we have this macroeconomic feedback that re-estimates our demand going under policy scenarios. So our base scenario, again, this is just showing gigatons of CO2 per year going forward. The black is our history, and the array of scenarios going forward is the database from the AR5 report. I've replotted it so that it's looking at cumulative emissions rather than the RCP, so you can see what the temperature rise is likely to be. Our base case is lower than some of the higher RCP scenarios, basically because they're ours is the least cost optimization model, basically. So our 2 degree scenario then is down here, where then the scenario, or the event that was just on before us, it's showing what the INDCs are making. The INDCs are far above what we need to be doing with regards to decarbonisation. We're already off trajectory, so following on the decarbonisation, we need to be net negative by 2070. So you can see the decarbonisation rate that we need to make using that cumulative budget of 1,000 gigatons between now and 2100. So our model is a global model. So these are the regions. Just I'm bringing this up just to make sense of the acronym. So Africa, AF4, Australia, US, Canada, China, Central South America, Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, India, Japan, Middle East, Mexico, the rest of the region, South Korea, Japan, and Western Europe. So I'm arranging these in order of GDP per capita from left, so Africa having the lowest GDP per capita to the USA, cumulatively over the whole horizon. When you break down that 3,200 gigaton budget for all time, for all emissions, and you weight it for the cumulative population over that horizon from 1950 to 2100, based on the UN population statistics and the projections, this is the equitable budget that you see for each of those 15 regions that is in our global model. So when you look at what has happened historically, you can see these are the emissions from 1750 to 2100. Again, these are looking at fossil fuel and industry emissions. So that sums up to roughly 2,200 gigatons. You can see the regions that have broken through their barriers. If we meet a 2 degree scenario, these are the optimized least cost emissions that we see in our model. You start to see certain regions, so Africa overall time doesn't go anywhere near using its total equitable budget of the global budget. China currently hasn't gone beyond its budget, but has about 200 gigatons to spare, but even in our 2 degree scenario will go beyond its equitable budget. Canada has already gone beyond its budget, but most of the developed countries have also gone far beyond their equitable budget on a per capita basis of that 3,200 gigatons. So we ran our model, but what was more novel and what we were really trying to do is we get a least cost solution when we get the GDP impacts, but how do we balance those impacts across for different burden sharing rules or effort sharing rules? So we applied many different rules. I'm just going to show 3 today. We constrained the African emissions to be this trajectory, so their African emissions is allowed to grow to 2050 and contracts beyond 2100. Basically, that all regions has to have an equal per capita emissions by 2050. So it starts where we are now and interpolates to 2050. So Africa starts where it is with some growth. Canada starts where it is and has to rapidly decline to 2050. China starts where it is now and still has to decline to 2050. Everybody is equal per capita then thereafter. So those are the trajectories or the constraints for that contract and converge rule. The really interesting one from my perspective, this past and future equity takes all time into account. What is our past emissions per capita and what will be the future emissions per capita on a regional basis. So as I showed earlier, Canada has already gone past its equitable budget, so it needs to pay off its its past emissions, so that's spread over the total model horizon, and then it needs to trade all its future emissions. So if Canada isn't sequestering more than 25 tons of CO2 per person, it has to buy carbon permits at the marginal abatement cost in that year. So 2020, the marginal abatement cost is roughly $100 per tonne, and it rises exponentially to over $3,500 by 2100. So Canada's there. China, as I said, hasn't gone past its equitable budget. It does in 2060, so it can do what it wants until 2060 and has to buy permits thereafter. And those are the rest of the rules. The USA is similar to Canada, and Europe is there somewhere lower again. What is probably more, or potentially more politically feasible, is a similar rule starting where we are now, and then on a per capita basis, and interpolating to an equitable cumulative proportion of the future emissions based on historical responsibility. So Africa starts where it is now. It can grow per capita quite largely, but also to recognise that the population growth in Africa is quite fast over the next 80 years, to go into nearly 4 billion by 2100. So it's emissions per capita are growing, but also the population as a total is growing, so the gross emissions allowed to Africa is quite large, and they can trade then that excess of emissions. Canada similarly has to contract down to 2050, China as well, and then the rest of the countries are as follows.
Can you put back that slide for me?
Sure.
And WEU is Western.
So WEU is Western Europe, and also then beyond 2080, we need to be going net negative. So there's no trading of emissions thereafter. So while the marginal abatement cost gets quite high, the cost per region is less, because they just have to pay for themselves. It'll be borne out in the results. So just to summarise those three rules, if you're emitting on a regional basis above those rules, you have to buy the excess carbon at the marginal abatement cost that the 2-degree scenario gives. So from $100 per tonne in 2020, rising exponentially to over $3,500 per tonne in 2100. So the GDP impact of just the 2-degree scenario, without any equalisation for the sake of equity, is already quite large. So again, this is organised on the left, so Africa, low GDP per capita to the richest in the world, on the right, and then also take note that the world GDP loss doesn't change because it's the control system, but just to show that in each rule the global GDP loss stays the same. We're just trading to equalise within the rules that I already outlined. So just to note that developing countries have a high, or 5% or more GDP loss compared to the developed regions on the right-hand side. So Western Europe, Canada, etc. US has about 3% GDP loss. And then energy exporting countries in the middle, for obvious reasons, have a much larger GDP loss.
Which is FSU again?
Former Soviet Union.
Soviet.
Yeah, so former Soviet Union, MEA is Middle East, Australia, again, so any of the energy exporting countries in the middle are quite heavily constrained. So the first rule is contract and converge. You know, it's put out as a rule that's quite useful, but it opens up some level of gaming. So the former Soviet Union and Australia, because they have potential for sequestration, for high value export of biomass created liquid fuels for transport, but become very expensive long term, they have a potential to actually game these rules that are meant to be about equity and not gaming the system. But you can also see for China that their GDP loss increases in that per capita the contract and converge rule. Looking at the past and future equity, so balancing all future emissions so that each person cumulatively has the same access to a tonne of CO2 from 1750 to 2100. This is what happens. So Africa has quite a large capital transfer goes up to 35% of GDP increase. Then different regions, developing regions. So on the right-hand side, Western Europe, Canada, Japan are the ones who are having to pay off. So their GDP loss is quite large. So they're going from where they were in the 2-degree scenario, just least cost optimized at 3%, going upwards of 10% of GDP loss out over the horizon. And so the last rule, which is politically possibly more feasible or more useful, is a dump and down version of that. So some of the rules are positive and negative depending on which region you are and what rule is most in your economic benefit regards long-term growth. So again, to note, Africa can have a considerable capital transfer input, increasing its GDP by 35% compared to the basically, or the 2-degree case, and Australia, because they have such potential for sequestration, low population density, and potential for export of biofuels long term, which is one of the really marginal and critical technologies, has quite a large GDP growth in the long term.
2 minutes, James.
Okay, so I'm going to have to quickly run through these. So Europe, looking at the rules, it's paying basically somewhere between 1.2 trillion to 14 trillion, discounted at 5% over the whole horizon. You can see on the 2-degree scenario it's 3%, in the full equity scenario they're minus 10% GDP. China loses in all the scenarios, but just the least cost 2-degree scenario, the 6% on the left is the optimum for them. They're paying over the whole horizon somewhere between $4.9 trillion and 8.5, again discounted at 5%. The undiscounted figures are below. India then benefits from the full kind of past and future equity because they haven't gone anywhere near their full equity budget. So they increase their GDP by 2% over the whole model horizon between 2020 and 2100, and they lose then to different degrees for the different rules. Africa is the most obvious one, given their low population, or well, not the low population, is the low carbon intensity. They're relatively low GDP, and any capital transfers that they get inbound from the system has quite a large impact on their GDP. So just really concluding, equity is critical for the talks here in Paris. I don't know that it's being fully raised there, but talking to people in the corridors, it's being somewhat sidelined. Those are just the summary figures, and I should stop.